So, have you been waiting for me to get back? Of course I know you were. Thank you all for the warm comments of support. I am very pleased that I have such a responsive audience like you. But let me tell you a little bit about the innovations on the channel. At the moment, I have created a second channel for short stories, the link to which will be in the description. So far, there is nothing there, but soon I will also post videos there with some frequency. On this channel, videos will now be released steadily every week. Let's start with a stable 3 videos a week, because I need to get back into the pace and not immediately rush for everything and at once. I think you understand me in this point. Also, now I'm hooking up a Patreon instead of the past Telegram group, so if you want to read the full stories, you know there's a link to that Patreon in the description. And yes, it's a promotional integration. Okay, let's go. Today we have on the agenda a very interesting, what I think is a story from one of my friends that got me thinking about some of the bad habits that love can impose on us. A couple of puffs. Chapter 1. Unfortunately, I'm also the type of girl that most men look past it. Not even a hint of a look. At least, that's what it seemed to me. Regular, quiet, submissive, church-going Julia Green. In my 24 years, I was fortunate enough to still be living with my parents, but unfortunately we had just moved across the state to a new town for my father's job. In a way, I was lucky. I wasn't leaving much behind, just a part-time job at a small Christian bookstore, and of course, no real friends to speak of. Not even at the church I'd gone to all my life, when the doors were open. Even the other girls found me too weird and too sheltered. Maybe so, but it was for the best, and I believed that. I never doubted my parents and what they were doing. It was the way things were done, and I was more than okay with that. God told me how grateful I should be. But there's no denying that life got a little lonely after a while. The reason is that I spent a lot of time, when I wasn't at church, alone at home. It was then that I did a lot of cooking and cleaning for my parents. For recreation, if time allowed, I also loved to sew and knit. Over the years, I made more clothes than I could wear. Most of them I gave away as soon as they were finished, but some things, the best ones, I kept. Like, for example, the dress I wore to my first Sunday service at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. It was a simple, almost shapeless lilac dress with thin straps, worn over a white short-sleeved shirt. It had lilac buttons all along the front, and the skirt came down to just above my ankles. I wore simple brown sandals with clear nail polish on my feet to match my toes. My bushy brown hair was styled as best as I could with just a comb, and I applied very light natural makeup. I looked a lot like my mother, who was different from her only in her graying hair and aged skin. With butterflies in my stomach, I approached the new little one-story-old church with my family. Outside was a neat churchyard with a well-maintained large graveyard, and what appeared to be the priest's house just off to the side. Entering the main hall through the large wooden double doors, my gaze darted across the bright, freshly cut spring flowers, adorning the stained glass windows leading me forward. It had only been a few weeks since the Easter services, and everything looked very rosy. That's when I first saw it. Father Boss, standing among the other parishioners, and surrounded by old dark wooden pews. The church was very similar to the one we had left at home, though perhaps a little older. He was a well-built, distinguished-looking, clean-shaven man, with graying blonde hair, dressed in the dark robes of a priest. When he turned, I saw that his kind but icy blue eyes were fixed directly on the 3 of us, and he looked away from the family he was talking to, then came toward us. "Welcome, the Green family, right?" he asked, and his deep, strong, authoritative voice traveled through my body as he shook my father's hand firmly. My mom, who was standing nearby, never extended hers as they were left lying at her sides, and I, being nice, did the same, stepping back a little again to give the men a chance to speak. "Yes, you are correct. I'm Joel, and this is my wife Heather and daughter Julia. It's nice to finally meet you after all these letters," Dad said with a polite smile. It came as no surprise to me that he had already been in contact with the minister of our new church. In fact, I was sure he was talking to several to decide which church was best for us. It was just his way of taking care of us, and I was truly grateful that he was taking such good care of me. If my dad decided it was the best option for our family, then that was the way it was. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Green. I know you have a wonderful family. As you already know, I'm Father Boss. Blue eyes turned to Mom and me as he introduced himself and turned, gesturing for us to follow him. Father was dressed in a traditional black cassock with a cape, and of course, a white clerical collar around his neck to show his status. At the sight of this man, I felt as confident as a priest should feel. He led us to the front of the church, gesturing to his right to the hard wooden pews. "Please, I would be honored if you would sit in the front, at least for the first service," he commented. My father grinned like a cat that got the cream, status paramount. He looked pleased with that, his hands traveling down my mother's back, gently nudging her to sit down. She pushed his hand away gently, and I followed her and sat next to her, leaving room for him in the other seat. "Thank you, Father. That's very kind of you. We are very happy to be in your church and, of course, to hear you preach." They talked some more, as the quiet murmur of conversation grew as the church filled with other well-dressed families. After a couple more minutes, Father Boss shook my father's hand again as he had to leave us to get ready to begin the ceremony. His piercing blue eyes lingered on me and my mother for a millisecond. Then he nodded politely to each of us before leaving. At first, it looked like our old church. My father made a good choice. We began by singing beautiful hymns that we all knew, with a small choir in front, and passing the offering tray, in which my father left a generous amount of bills, as he always did. When the sermon began, everything fell into place for me. Dr. Boss spoke with such passion and power, knowing the word and delivering it to us in such a way that his deep, murmuring voice penetrated me to the bone. His voice easily filled the large room as he stood in the pulpit with his Bible open before him, but never once did his eyes lower as he delivered his message, finding the right page. He spoke from his heart about our salvation and damnation without needing notes or anything else. It was an amazing display of knowledge and, importantly, godliness. Toward the end, tears came to my eyes. As I was finishing, it dawned on me that he had been speaking for over an hour. I was mesmerized by the way he preached to us. Even though it was so good, it felt like only a few minutes had passed. I was completely captivated. The way he spoke was like a drug to me. His voice made my heart flutter. I realized that this was the man who was to lead me to heaven, and I would do my best to follow his every word. After the entire congregation sang the Lord's Prayer, I felt satiated. As everyone was packing up to leave, I looked at my father, eyes wide and glowing with newfound motivation. "Can I speak to Father Boss, please? I want to ask him about some church duties that need to be done during the week." These were things I did at the old church as well, mostly cleaning and preparing programs for each Sunday. It wasn't much, but anything I could do would be fine. "Yeah, come on," he replied, helping his mom up from her seat and straightening the long skirt of her blue dress. Fortunately, I immediately jumped to my feet and waited for my chance to talk to my father. The line was already small, and I let the others go ahead since they were more experienced church members, and most of them were men. When everyone was done, I approached the man and realized how tall he was. The priest towered over me and my small figure, making my cheeks sinfully flush. Ignoring it, I smiled, putting one hand behind my back and stroking the silver crucifix around my neck with the other. "That was a beautiful sermon, Father. I enjoyed it very much. I was wondering if I could sign up to help with the upkeep of the church. Until I found another small job to occupy my time, or a husband, I wanted to provide for myself as much as I could. I didn't want to sit at home all day. The good Lord wanted me to be busy. Thank you, my young lady. I hope I continue to impress you. Of course, we could always use the extra hands," he replied, waving for me to follow him to the exit. I stood on the step, leading up to the pulpit, as he pulled out a pen and a small notepad. My father wrote down my information and said I could come back the next day and help clean up. The place was so safe and welcoming, I couldn't wait to come back the next day and help with the cleanup. I woke up before sunrise, and I was frustrated that I had to wait in my bed until it was time to get up to make breakfast. I couldn't start too early. Dad might complain about the noise. I gave in and got up early. It was nice to get up early on Monday, as my father was also on his feet, since it was his first day at his new job, and he needed to make breakfast and pack lunch quickly, which I dutifully took care of, and my mother helped him get dressed. As soon as he was out the door, since it was threatening to start raining, my mom graciously let me borrow her white hatchback to drive the short distance to the church and get to my duties. I parked just a few minutes after Father Boss told me he would be up and running at the church. I put on my usual long brown ankle-length skirt, a simple white t-shirt, and the white sneakers I used to clean the house in. As I approached the entrance to the fancy church house, my nose twitched when it was tickled, and then I noticed something disturbing with the corner of my eye. It was like puffs of smoke. I rushed toward the building, pulled out my rarely used cell phone, and prepared to dial 911 when the distinct and strong bitter smell of cigarettes wafted to me, and I was very surprised to see Boss's father in front of me, wearing a black short-sleeved shirt with a white collar, cinched with a black belt and slacks. A cigarette dangled from his lips as he looked up from his cell phone and looked at me with some shock. "Oh, Julia, I apologize. I'm running a little late this morning," he grinned. Taking a thin white stick out of his mouth, he playfully ran his finger over his lips in a gesture of silence. "Please, let this remain between the two of us. We each have our vices, right?" He smiled happily. I was shocked to see it. I'd only ever seen someone smoke in public once before, and I'd been led to believe over and over again that it was one of the worst things you could ever do. But as I stood there and watched Father Boss take a couple of last puffs, and then the smoke started wafting from his lips like an inverted waterfall, I just watched it, and my mind went blank. In a way, it made my body feel just as fuzzy too. "Yes, of course, Father. I won't talk about it," I quickly assured him, even though I knew I had to tell my father immediately. If he found out, he would probably suspend us from the church, and that was the last thing I wanted. I was just getting back on my feet. "Thank you, young lady." Father Boss extinguished the smoking cigarette butt against the sole of his black boot and deftly flicked it into the terracotta flower pot by the back door. Come on, I'll show you around," he said, leading me up the small wooden staircase into the church. We entered a dimly lit hallway, and my father led me to a door directly across the hall. This was his office, which looked quite different from what I had imagined. It was fairly modern for a priest, with a nice computer chair behind a desk with a laptop on it. It was outdoorsy. I rarely saw Dad's office, since he kept it away from Mom and me. Not too surprising, for we didn't even have a family TV, as my parents didn't see the need for one, and preferred that I study the Bible or read for entertainment. Again, I was delighted that Boss's father had a television hanging on the opposite wall. "We keep our cleaning supplies here." He led me over to a small closet that held all the cleaning supplies. I was then shown the small community kitchen, the bathroom, and the door to the outside leading to the priest's house. Before I could get to work, I had to go to daily mass, which I happily participated in with a much smaller crowd, maybe less than a dozen people, than the full church the day before. It was a calming experience that put me in the right frame of mind when I realized I was going to do God's work, especially the cleaning that was ahead of me, and I knew where to start when the crowd began to disperse. When the church was finally empty, it seemed like it took forever for the congregation to finish their conversations. I stopped, looked around, and realized that the church was amazing, and I took a deep breath and felt at home. When Father Boss saw the last parishioners off, I was released to clean up, and I went straight to work in the sanctuary, taking my time, washing the pulpit with extra care, and even cleaning up the burned-out candles at the altar. I spent several hours that day cleaning just that area alone, even going inside the confessional booths to make sure both sides were spotless. I took great pleasure in my work for the great Lord and looked at it all with pride when I was finished. But something was weighing on me, and I did not want to leave the place of worship. I prayed for a while, kneeling at the altar and thanking the Lord for all he had given me. Then I brought the cleaning supplies and knocked on Father Boss's office door. "Come in!" As I entered the house, I heard the sound of the TV on, and looking closer, I saw my father watching some kind of action movie. "I'm done with the church, Father. I hope it's up to your standards," I said, putting everything in the closet and making sure everything was in its proper place. "Of course you did. You were gone so long. I wondered if you'd run away or something." He grinned, got up from the table and walked around it. "Thanks for the hard work, Julia." "Of course. I only wish I could do more. Can I come back in the morning to work in the kitchen and bathroom?" I asked, hoping I'd be allowed. With a slight chuckle, the priest nodded, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning on the table behind him. "I could always use some help. Be careful or I'll make you do boring yard work with me. Father Boss teasingly warned, causing another angry blush to form on my cheeks. After a moment's silence between us, I finally exhaled. Father, may I confess a sin that I haven't committed yet? He arched an eyebrow, tilting his head to the side, showing genuine interest. Yes, my young girl. But why would you knowingly commit such a crime? Well, for you, Father, I replied, I will keep what I saw today from my father when he gets home. It would be a lie, and I know that if he knew the truth, he would choose another church. Smoking is so ungodly and terrible for the temple of your body. It does so much damage. Father Boss was silent for a moment, seeming to contemplate what to say. Don't think of it as a lie per se, but think of it as gossip. After all, that's the category it falls into, isn't it? He asked. Gossip? I didn't give it a second thought. To me, it was lying through omission. At least that's how I understood it. The priest nodded. Yes, you will share a secret that does not belong to you. To abstain from it would be more holy than to tell it. Now, if my habit strikes you as so repugnant that you wish to leave, I shook my head. No, isn't what I mean. I don't want to leave, so I won't tell him. My heart raced. I blushed even harder, this time feeling like I was being told off. Because that would be gossip, Father. He looked pleased with this answer, and a smile appeared on his face. Very good, my young girl. I shall see you in the morning, then? After a few weeks of going to church every day of the week, I took it as something I was having so much fun that I didn't need a day of rest. Instead, I was at church when I was supposed to be in town looking for a new job, and I could tell that Mom and Dad were already starting to worry about the gaps in my resume. Dad printed out job postings from the internet almost daily from stores in and around town and left them on the kitchen table where I sat and ate breakfast. I was fine where I was, so I could fold them up and ignore them. I was busy integrating myself into the community. There was always something to prepare for. Weddings, christenings, and of course, sadly, funerals. There was always something going on. Candles had to be prepared daily. Flowers had to be changed. The choir was constantly practicing. Even people wanting to find old relatives' graves or look at old records. The floors always had to be swept. We were like busy bees, all trying our best to support an equally busy Father Boss. I even helped with the parishioners' children, and Father Boss was actively considering turning one of the storage rooms in the basement into a Sunday school because he had an idea. He wanted me to teach them the Word of God. After all these years, I have learned all that God has given me. It was my honor and privilege to pass it on. I was more than happy to help with cleaning the dusty, cobweb-ridden old room and help him with painting to make it brighter and happier, as it really was a basement. Being downstairs with him in the dusty basement was both exciting and wrong at the same time. Wrong because it was exciting, and at the same time completely right, because I looked forward to it so much every day. The time spent with him was just enjoyable, too much so. I felt at peace in his presence, even if he left me splattered with paint, winked at me, and then often slipped away to smoke another cigarette. But at one point, despair gripped me. I had no one to share this wonderful feeling with, no one to explain it all to. No one else could know how I felt about him, especially how quickly I was becoming attached to Father Boss. Even my parents thought it was important to my growing connection with God that I spend so much time under his care and helping out at the little church. However, they really wanted me to find a real job with a decent salary to pay the bills. I had to admit that I missed the hours spent researching and buying new fabrics and then sewing clothes. Every weekday I came early, well before morning mass, to make sure everything was in place. I knew it would be, but I had to make time, even if I was just cleaning up wilted flowers from the pulpit. There was another important reason to come early too. More often than not, if I timed it right, I would catch the priest outside for his morning smoke. I preferred to spend this time with him at the entrance to the church, finding the smell of his cigarette strangely quite appealing. As it dripped off the cigarette and tickled my nose, it was, I thought, very pleasant. Another reason for me to feel like a sinner. You must not enjoy this unpleasant habit. That was something I did not confess to him. His smoking near the church reminded me of a boy I liked at my old church. We were the same age, and I grew up around him, but never socialized or even made a real friendship. In the back of my mind, I knew my parents would disapprove of him, but he was so handsome. He had blonde hair, though he didn't look like a priest at all. One day I caught him, while cleaning up dead flowers in the cemetery, kneeling between a couple of headstones and lighting a cigarette. Our eyes met, but I didn't say anything, as I didn't want him to get in trouble. To this day, I think that's why my parents kept me away from him. For the next few weeks, though, I would often spot him with a cigarette in his hand, and then I would go home and pray for him, hoping he would quit his horrible addiction. After Mass, I would clean up the church again, and then go down to the basement to do whatever needed to be done. Fortunately, Father Boss was courageous, and took on all the hard work of lifting and removing all the scary bugs I found down there. He was such a courageous man. I knew in my heart that he was untouchable, that he was the kind of man I should lust after. I had a hard time. I spent the evening sewing on my ancient Singer machine, using old fabric, confusing my thoughts to come to the conclusion that I did, in fact, desire my new priest. I wanted to confess so badly, knowing that if I refused in advance, I would end up in hell. But how could I do it? I tried, in fact, every Tuesday and Thursday. I sat in the booth and longed to smell that almost soothing odor of cigarette smoke, but because there was a screen between us, I couldn't. So I sat, staring into the dim space, and talked to him. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," I began, clutching my rosary beads tightly in my hands, so tightly that my knuckles turned white and numb. "What's the matter, my young lady?" I paused, wondering if I should tell him the truth, which I did, or if I should spend the night thinking about it and tell him about my spare sin. Being human, I knew I needed to confess more than one sin each week. It was just that this one was the biggest. The other day I got mad at my dad. He jumped on me for folding his socks wrong. So I oversalted his dinner to the point where it became inedible. He got mad at me for that too, and sent me to get something at the cafe that he could eat. I think Father Boss almost laughed at that, before he told me to do a lot of Hail Marys to make it up to him. Still, it was heavy on my heart from the blossoming of inappropriate thoughts I had for the man on the other side. I just couldn't bring myself to tell him about it. At least not yet, though I really wished I could begin to heal from this disease. The disease of love. Things were getting out of control. While working on a new dress at home, I changed my mind and recut half of it, as it ended up being a long skirt, but it was a bit fitted to my body. My curves were visible because of the high waist, and I wondered if I would ever be able to wear it. Of course, my parents would never let me leave the house in it, but as I tried it on and admired my shape in the mirror, I imagined wearing it on Sunday. It was very similar to the dresses and skirts other women wore, but to my family it was scandalous. Plus, my old baggy, stretchy underwear was too visible through it, and it was always trying to fall off. My mum was such a hypocrite. It wasn't long ago that I washed her new lacy panties and bras regularly. One day I asked why I couldn't buy such pretty things, and she just brushed it off as a mom thing, along with the phrase, "Please don't tell Daddy." She smiled dreamily at me and then said, "One day you'll hear about it from God." She gathered the clean underwear into a bag and headed up the stairs, stopping halfway to pick up the fallen underwear. I knew right away that I needed something else to go with my dress if I wanted to wear it. Or, if I wanted to be really naughty in this situation, then maybe no underwear at all. There is something about not wearing anything under my clothes that fascinates me. The thought was as daring as it was exciting. So much so that one day I actually tried it. It was a Friday, and I went through Mass and the daily cleaning without them. I put them in my bag just in case, but the feeling of being both naughty and naked at the same time was exhilarating, even though I was wearing one of my long, flowing cream-colored dresses that reached my ankles and covered my body well. It was so strange to feel the pew under my butt, and every time I needed to kneel, the fabric of the dress rested against my bare buttocks. I was afraid I would move the wrong way, and my butt would jiggle too much and be caught by the small congregation. As I moved around, I could feel the cool air under my skirt as I was busy cleaning up when everyone left. I cautiously made my way down to the basement, where Father Boss was already standing in the middle of the room, looking around in deep thoughtfulness. We finally got the room cleared out, and I was finishing up some deep cleaning that day. Soon we would need to set up tables and chairs and decorate the room for the kids. I went down the last step and out of sight for a moment to admire the older man, his strong hand under his chin lightly stroking his clean-shaven skin, his gaze darting around. I took another step down, and the floorboard creaked. He looked up at me and smiled. I was thinking, I can hook up a speaker system in here. I'd hate for you to miss the entire sermon on Sunday while you're here, he commented thoughtfully. I sank to the hard concrete floor, humming and nodding slightly at the thought. Glancing up at the ceiling, I figured his strong, marvelous voice wouldn't be heard through the solid foundation anyway. After all, it was an old building. Great idea, Father, I said with a smile, walking over to the new supply closet where we had moved all of our cleaning supplies. Taking out everything we needed to clean the walls again, I set to work, trying not to disturb him. Your sermon is so moving. I think the children need to hear it too. Maybe while they color and make crafts to take home to their parents. Is that your lesson plan? He asked with a slight smirk on his face. I chuckled lightly as I used the mop and can of cleaner to scrub the wall in front of me. I thought I'd start at the beginning and work my way through the Bible. I have a few books at home with Bible stories for kids. I grinned back. Working hard, I was careful in my movements. I didn't want to shake too much. Reaching the top of the wall to wash it was even more nerve-wracking. I could feel Father Boss's eyes lingering on my body as I worked. Looking up at him, I noticed that his gaze was lowered lower than it should have been, which made me blush slightly. I can finish up here if you have other things to do, Father, I offered politely. He nodded and took a moment to move toward the stairs. Then I'll go to the office and see what's up with the speaker system. Let me know if you need anything, Julia. My name had never sounded so good. I loved the way it flew off his tongue. I smiled at him. While he was gone and not watching my ass, I scrubbed the walls vigorously and then started on the floors. Cleaning was a pleasure. All the while, I was easily immersed in thoughts of the man in his office upstairs. I thought about what it would be like to have him standing next to me. Even his strong hands could touch me gently. I also needed to get my head in order. This was already going too far. I blamed it on inhaling cleaning fluids. Digging around in the depths of the closet with the new supplies, I found something. It was a small wooden case that I pulled out and blew the dust off of it. I stared at it in amazement, looking at the cross carved into the top. Eager to open it, I walked up the stairs and knocked on Father Boss's office door. Come in. Father, I found something, I told him as I entered the room and placed the box on his desk. He furrowed his brow and reached for it, pulling it closer, then flipped open the small clasp on the front and opened it to reveal a few little things. A small glass holy water vial with a cross engraved on the front, an old wooden rosary, and a Bible that looked like it had been perfectly preserved in the time it had been left untouched. I see, Father Boss said softly, taking everything out and examining it. Taking the leather-bound Bible in his hands, he handed me an old glass vial. Looks like it belonged to the last priest who ran this church. Let's see. He opened it and nodded. Yes, it belonged to Father Harrison. I didn't get to meet him, but I've heard good things from the older people in the congregation. Closing the book again, he slowly ran a muscular hand over the front of the book, wiping away any dust that might have been there, and just enjoying the way it felt under his thick fingers. I was in such a daze that the vial slipped out of my hands and shattered on the floor. I shrieked sharply and jumped back. "Oh no, I'm so sorry, Father," I said quickly, feeling terrible about breaking something so old and meaningful. Chuckling quietly, her father shook his head. "It's all right, my young lady. We have dozens of them now," he assured me, standing up and tucking the Bible back into the small rosary chest. "No need to worry." Despite his words, I was already starting to worry as I knelt down and mindlessly picked through the small shards. Before Father Boss could say anything to stop me, I let out another shrill sigh as I felt a small shard cut the tip of my finger. Father Boss was by his desk in seconds, taking the glass from me and tossing it into the wastebasket. "A little clumsy today, aren't you?" he asked with a slight chuckle, taking my hand in his and examining the cut site. There was a lot of blood, so he motioned for me to sit in one of the chairs in front of his desk and went to get the first aid kit. Putting it back in place, he began to clean me up, and I was over the moon at how nice it felt for him to touch me, even though it stung a little, as he lubed the alcohol and bandaged my finger. His hands were so soft and warm, not to mention big around my own. After tidying me up, he smiled slightly, still standing next to me. "Well, there you go, all better." He brought my hand up to his mouth and lightly kissed the tip of my bandaged finger. The feel of soft lips against my finger made me warm, and I shuddered a little. I'd only experienced that once or twice before. Everything around me became warm, as I had become all too aware of in the past few days. Though it had never happened to me outside of the bedroom and under the sheets at night. I was shockingly silent for a moment, and then with a quick movement, I pulled away. "Thank you, Father. I have to go," I said, backing away from him. He didn't seem too surprised by my suddenness. He just let go of me and nodded. "Of course, please be careful on your way home," he said, smiling playfully. "I'll see you tomorrow, right?" Saturdays were my favorite because we only had vigil at the end of the day, early evening. Thus, I had time to get a lot of church work done before then, but my heart was racing. I felt something was wrong with me. "Yes, I'll be here in the morning, Father," I assured him, walking out of the office and waving a trembling hand at him. When I got home, I took the coldest shower I could take to cool down my burning body and clean up after all the nasty thoughts that had been spewing out of me. Luckily, after the shower, no one noticed that I was quiet, doing chores around the house. My mom didn't mind the quiet, as we were both preparing dinner for the evening, me helping prepare the vegetables, and at the table, my dad was doing most of the talking as usual, so I was left to sit, immersed in my own thoughts. My thoughts, which were so exciting and also shameful in equal measure. I just couldn't keep the obscene images out of my mind. That night in bed, they were still swirling around me, and so I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I had an uncontrollable urge, and it had blissful thoughts. And on this night, I did it, indulging in my recurring and darkest fantasies about Father Boss. I lay there and imagined it all. It was as if I could really feel him. I ended up gasping and shuddering with intense pleasure coursing through my body, my head thrown back and my brown curls tangled and covering my face and pillow. I gasped softly. This was fun, but then guilt began to plague me. My mind had already gone too far, and now I was only making it worse. Is there redemption for people like me? I was now tainted with the passionate sin of fantasizing about touching myself, dreaming of an untouchable man. And deep down, I knew that this growing desire was only getting stronger. Looking around, I was very pleased with myself. The basement of the church was really up to par. It no longer looked like a storage room, but began to look like a place of learning and worship. Pictures and posters hung on the freshly painted and cleaned walls. A whiteboard stood on a slightly clunky stand in front, and tables and chairs were arranged in neat rows. That Sunday, I was getting ready to start class, and made sure I had plenty of Adam and Eve coloring pages and books from my house that I would use. I decided to leave them at church, and was very happy that the church allowed me to keep them. Oh, it's beautiful! A small group of parishioners had come to see where their children would be spending Sunday morning, and it was gorgeous. They were nodding and smiling, all looking pleased. I straightened up in my brown dress, trying not to let a single wrinkle show. "You're quite the catch, Julia. Really. We talked to Father Boss about it, but he never agreed because he never has time. You've become his little shadow. That's lucky for all of us," one of the women, Brenda, commented as she approached me. I blushed slightly and giggled. "I'm so glad I was able to help with this project. The kids will love it, I'm sure," I said, looking at the small wooden table that Father Boss had set up for me. There was a speaker hanging on the wall above my new desk, with a sermon being broadcast overhead. I also had a small remote that I could use to turn the volume up or down to be able to teach during the sermon. Again, I was sure we would hear it without it, but I appreciated it anyway. "You've been a wonderful addition to the church," Brenda added, with a broad smile on her plump face, and the other women nodded in agreement. I smiled back, feeling pleased that they liked me so much. I had made more friends with them than I had with the people at my old church, and I had lived there all my life. "Thank you so much, Miss Brenda. I plan on staying here for a long time," I giggled. "Forever, in fact. I never wanted to leave this place." "You should think about becoming a nun," one of the women, Margaret, said, and I quickly shook my head, still laughing a little. "Oh, no. I don't think that's my calling. I want to be a wife one day and have children of my own." So why was I longing for a man who could never do that for me? It was like I was savoring the unattainable. "Ah, hello, ladies," a murmuring voice echoed through the hallways. The voice I loved so much. Father Boss came down in his usual casual black clothes, smiling at each of us. "What do you guys think? We've been working hard on it the last few weeks," he said. "This is awesome, Father. The kids will be so excited on Sunday when they can come here and have a more soft-spoken teacher to lead them to the Lord." Brenda laughed, teasing him. Dad laughed too, shaking his head. "I guess I can be a little too strict for the young ones," he admitted. They talked for a few minutes, after which we were left alone in the basement classroom while the women went off to their knitting group. I busied myself laying out art supplies and such on the tables. We wouldn't be able to fill all the seats since there were only a few kids in the congregation, but maybe one day there would be a full room. "You look excited," Father Boss remarked. I smiled, looking back at him over my shoulder. "Oh yeah," I said it, letting my eyes linger on him a little too long as he leaned back against my small desk. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I wondered if he knew. Could he see right through me and tell that I was undressing him in my head right then and now? He looked so handsome with his big, strong arms and the smile on his face. I could have melted. This man was so distinguished and handsome, like one of the actors in the action movies I regularly watched. "It's a beautiful day today. Would you like to come outside with me?" he asked suddenly. I was sure he was going to smoke if no one else was around. But the magical thing was that it was the first time I had ever been invited to go out with him. I couldn't refuse. I nodded my head before I could even think about it. I followed him to the back door down a narrow, dim hallway, and when I got outside, the sun was almost blinding. The wind fluttered my loose skirt a little, forcing me to lower my arms so it wouldn't ride up and show too much of my legs. "Wow, it really is beautiful. It's usually so hot here," I said, looking around. When my gaze fell on Boss's father again, he was, as expected, holding a cigarette between his lips, lighting it from the wind with his hand. I couldn't look away. There was something so tantalizing about it. And the smell, once the cigarette was lit, made me move closer. Father Boss immediately noticed this and smiled slightly as he took a deep puff. "Ever tried it?" he asked, taking the cigarette out of my mouth and holding it out to me between his fingers. "It's a terrible habit, but you're old enough now that I don't mind sharing it with you if you want." For some reason, I really wanted this. My head was screaming no, but my heart was screaming yes. It came out of nowhere, because I'd never thought about trying it myself. Reaching out, I took my hand from his and squeezed it between my fingers, careful not to burn myself. I brought it to my lips and inhaled very slowly and carefully, feeling the smoke move down my throat and into my lungs. As I exhaled, I thought I would be okay, but then a horrible and uncontrollable cough started to hit me. Gasping, I heard Father Boss laugh as he took the cigarette from my outstretched hand. He smiled when I crinkled my face in disgust. "It takes a while to get past that part," he commented, taking another long puff while I just let out a series of small coughs to clear my throat. My throat was burning after all that, but the flavor stayed in my mouth and on my tongue. The flavor wasn't actually that bad. It had a slightly minty aftertaste. "I don't see how you're going to survive this," I moaned, curving my mouth and pressing my hand to my chest to take a few deep breaths of fresh air. "Like everything else in life, it takes practice," replied Father Boss, leaning the back of his head against the rough exterior wall of the building. "Julia, it's been a pleasure having you help me so much. I already had an assistant, but it was an older woman, and she ended up having to take over. When I was the only one taking care of things got out of hand," he admitted. I smiled as my face flushed slightly. "Thank you, Father. I am truly honored. I love giving my time to the church. I feel like this is where it's best." Was it? Was it really the best place I could be when I had such terribly warm feelings for the priest? Probably not. He gave me one of those smiles he always seemed to have because of his cigarette. His gaze made my heart race. I wondered why he had decided to become a priest, since he could have had any wife in the world. Maybe because no woman on this earth deserved him. But I was sure I wasn't the only one who wanted him. Far from it. Having been to church so often and for so long, I began to accept other women, just as my mom and I had at the previous church. Sometimes after a couple mugs of tea, they would not hesitate to talk about how hot the priest was. Of course, Mom and I never participated in these conversations, but we heard them. It was fun to go to church with Mom. However, I preferred to be alone. Sometimes I wondered what Mom thought about all of this, but she would never tell me, even if I asked, and I never thought to ask. "Are you okay?" His deep voice brought me out of my daze, and I blushed even more when I realized I'd been looking at him. "Yes, I'm fine, sorry about that," I giggled nervously. "I guess I'm just a little lost in my thoughts." It wasn't a lie, but I was also lost in it as a whole. It was so twisted and wrong. My gaze still lingered on him, but then moved to the almost finished cigarette between his lips. Those soft pink lips that touched my finger, that I wished were all over my body. "Can I try again?" I asked, reaching for him, and got a surprised look from the man. "Sure, just don't overdo it. We don't want you to choke." With those words, he handed it to me, and I brought the filter to my lips. After taking a slow, easy breath, I immediately started coughing. Not surprisingly, my lungs didn't like the foreign particles. Smoke came out in little trickles, and I felt a little silly when he laughed, taking the cigarette from me before I dropped it on the floor. The next day, "You're not leaving this house looking like that, and certainly not going to church." Mom's voice was as shrill as a drill bit piercing metal when she saw that I was wearing the long pencil skirt I had sewn a few weeks ago. My outfit was non-scandalous, a little fitted, perhaps emphasizing my bottom, but Mom looked like she could have fainted. It was a light brown skirt with a little knot at the waist that went all the way down to my ankles and was just right, with a short slit that reached my knee on one side. I even went out and secretly bought a little white thong to wear under the dress so I wouldn't have to go without it like I used to. I paired it with a baggy black button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up to my elbows. I was tired of only being able to wear the skirt in the privacy of my bedroom. I knew it looked good on me, and I wanted to show it off. Maybe it was vanity, but I didn't go out in a miniskirt. "Mom, it's no big deal. All the ladies at church wear things like this, and I like this skirt so much." I frowned, looking at my short black-heeled shoes that I wore to pair with this outfit, not used to arguing with my parents. "Besides, I'm going to help Father Boss with some paperwork today. It's the perfect time to wear it. That, and Sundays, but I wasn't about to push my luck." "You heard me, Julia Ruth." Her face was red with anger. She was even angrier that I had spoken back. Oh, that hurt. She used my middle name. "I'm an adult, Mom. I'll wear what I want," I snapped, shocking even myself. For a moment her eyes grew wide as saucers, but then they narrowed and she shook her head. "I won't be a part of this if you leave this house in that thing. You're not taking my car." What? My mouth dropped open, and I couldn't believe she was doing this to me, just because she didn't like what I was wearing. Without another word, Mom turned on her heel and went about her business in the kitchen. I knew she wasn't kidding, but I didn't let that stop me from going outside exactly the way I wanted to. I rolled my eyes and turned on my heels and sprinted out of the house. I had to walk, and I was worried about how things would turn out when I got home. I knew my mom would tell my dad no matter what, so I was already planning on staying at the church a little longer than usual. The walk took quite a while, and I had to miss morning mass for the first time since we'd moved to the new church. By the time I reached the place, my legs were sore. I was sweating and feeling uncomfortable. To my surprise, Father Boss was standing at the entrance to the church, without a cigarette, just standing there, and when he saw me, he quickly walked over. "Julia, what are you doing? Is something wrong?" he asked, walking with me the short distance I had to walk before I could finally sit down and take a break. "I'm sorry I'm late, Dad. I had a fight with my mom, and she wouldn't let me drive her car," I explained. I felt so humiliated. As a grown woman, I should have had my own car by now. If I had one, I wouldn't have gone through all this. Moreover, I began to think that I needed to get another job to be able to get my own place, as scary as that thought made me feel. Father Boss put his arm around my shoulders and led me inside, and as soon as the door closed behind us, his hand slipped and now rested on the middle of my back as he led me past his office. "You walked all the way in on foot? Oh, Julia, you should have called me or something. I would have come and picked you up," he said as we walked out the back door. I sank down on the steps right at the entrance. My skirt fell open and exposed my legs from the knee down. I immediately jerked up to cover myself, but noticing the way Boss's father's gaze lingered on them, I left it at that. I was so exhausted I didn't care that he was touching my back. I wanted to, I really did. At that moment, I craved any pleasurable physical emotion I could get my hands on. He stood to the side of me, lighting a cigarette between his lips, and as the smoke floated from his mouth, my father walked over and knelt down in front of me, placing his hand on my ankle and bringing it close to his. Jamming a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, he slowly and purposefully pulled my best Sunday shoes off my heel and, looking into my eyes, began rubbing my foot, causing me to sigh slightly. "Father, you don't need to do that," I said quickly, trying to pull away, but he held my foot both gently and firmly. "I know, but these aren't exactly walking shoes you've been wearing. Your feet must hurt terribly." He sounded almost dragon-like, smoke wafting from his mouth as he ran his thumb from the middle of the arch of my foot all the way down to my toes. It was amazing to feel him pressing against the sole of my foot. Because he was below me, the soothing smell of smoke was practically drawn into my nose. I sighed and leaned back on the step behind me, resting my elbows on the wooden platform in front of the door. Father Boss was doing a fine job. He was clearly practicing as he gently slid his hands down my leg, pausing to extinguish his cigarette and then getting back to work. He even ran his hand down the back of my leg, massaging the muscles there as well. "Glad you'll be doing a lot of sitting today. You've probably had more than enough exercise for today," he said almost playfully. His words made me smile for the first time since this morning's argument. "Yes, thank God for that," I said. He moved to the other foot, placing the shoe next to his pair and leaving the other one for now. He had the softest, strongest hands I'd ever felt in my life. "Tell me about the argument," said Father Boss, looking at me as he worked, the cigarette still dangling securely between his lips. "What could have made her do something like that?" I sighed and felt a little awkward about the situation, though in a way I was proud of myself for sticking to what I wanted. "Mom thinks this skirt is too tight, and the slit on the side is showing off too much skin. She wanted me to change, but I made it and I've wanted to wear it for so long," I explained, looking up at the trees whose branches danced in the wind above us as I spoke. "I see. Well, you look amazing, and I think the skirt is more than appropriate," Dad stated. I watched his eyes dart around and smiled again as he looked at my legs. He finished the massage and moved so that he sat down on the last step, right below me. He took a moment to puff on his cigarette, looking like he was deep in thought. "It's not right that they're controlling you to this extent. You're a good young woman they should be proud of, Julia. I wish they felt the same way. But thank you, Father. It means a lot after this morning." I reached down and touched the sore spot on the back of my heel that the shoes had rubbed. "Well, I'll give you a ride home later, if you want to, of course, but you shouldn't take any more long walks in inappropriate shoes," he teased with a slight chuckle. "I'm really impressed that you've come all this way." My heart raced. "That would be very nice, Father, thank you. And of course I made it here. I would never miss my duties here, only if it was necessary. I wouldn't miss a day spent with a handsome priest either." We sat outside and talked for a few more minutes, after which he tossed his cigarette into a flower pot standing nearby. I put on my uncomfortable shoes, and we went into the house to begin work on the pile of papers he needed help organizing. I sat down in the padded chair in front of his desk and began going through the papers, making different stacks depending on their number. "Would you like to pick something to watch while we work?" asked Father Boss, handing me the remote. I actually wanted to, but I didn't know what to watch. The only thing I was allowed to watch was what the church put on. Movies and programs for special occasions. They were all about the Lord and salvation. I shook my head and chuckled slightly. "Honestly, I don't even know what to show on it. We've never had a TV at home." "Wow, I see you've taken refuge," Dad teased, switching channels. He stopped on some daytime talk show. I'd never seen anything like it, and the whole time I was working I kept looking over my shoulder to see what was going on. I loved listening to them discuss the gossip of the day about celebrities I had never heard of. It was nice to listen to something while I sorted through all the paperwork, although I finished my work too quickly for my liking. True, I managed to spend a little more time putting everything in my father's empty file cabinet drawer, but when I was done, I didn't feel like leaving. I just sat and watched the man in front of me work on his laptop, his fingers typing so fast it seemed incredible to me that he was actually creating words. It seemed to me that he was just pressing buttons at random and as fast as he could. Looking at me through the computer screen, Father Boss focused his kind eyes and smiled slightly. "Are you done already? Well, I have one more task for you, if you like to bake," he offered. I nodded happily, excited to make something for the priest. It would be an honor for me. "Okay, this may seem a little strange, but I really wanted apple pie. I have everything I need to make it, but I don't really know how to cook," he grinned. "It came out awful, but I have enough food to make another one. Could you make me another one? An edible one?" I chuckled at his little story and nodded again. "My pleasure, Father," I replied, standing up and defending my modesty by instantly straightening my skirt. Cooking a pie from scratch would take some time, but I was willing to accept the challenge and do it just because he wanted to. He was a good, godly man. Father Boss deserved a sweet treat. I got up and went into the small kitchenette, already knowing where everything lay. I started my little project, peeled and sliced apples, and then set about making the shortcake from scratch. It was soothing while I got my hands dirty with flour and other ingredients. Once I had a nice ball of dough on the countertop in front of me, I pulled out a roller and started flattening it. Something about the thick wooden roller fascinated me a little. Rolling it over the dough, I stared at it, wondering how it related to something male. I'd never seen them before, except in anatomy textbooks at school. I was curious, to say the least. Coating the outside with flour, I found myself running my hand over it in a way I didn't need to. My fingers wrapped around the girth and sinfully imagined it was Father Boss and not just a tree. Realizing what I was doing, I blushed and silently reprimanded myself for thinking horribly dirty thoughts. It wasn't the best or prettiest pie crust, as I hurried to finish the flattening process to throw the roller away, as if it would be okay if the tool was out of my hands. But my mind was still reeling as I added the filling and covered the pie, crimping the edges of the pastry with a fork before placing it in the preheated oven. Once done, I prepared a large pitcher of lemonade and stowed it in the refrigerator to chill while I waited for the pie to finish cooking. It took me a long time to clean myself up, but when I was done, there was still time left on the oven timer for the pie. I sighed and leaned against the counter, looking outside, and as a brief cloud of smoke drifted in through the window, I thought about what had happened before. Thinking about how good it felt to feel his hands on me, gently rubbing and giving my legs the attention they so desperately needed. Now other parts of my body were craving the same touch. "What's up?" Father Boss's voice made me jump slightly, bringing my hand to my chest, and I looked back at the man with a slight chuckle. "You scared me. Everything is going well. The pie will be ready soon, and I'll put it out to cool," I told him, admiring the way he laughed and smiled at me. He walked over to the refrigerator and opened it, looking happily at the pitcher of lemonade. He even pulled out a glass of ice and immediately poured himself some. "You're a blessing, Julia." He took a sip and hummed slightly. "I'm going to the rectory to work on the sermon for Sunday. Feel free to join me if you'd like." I was to see the inside of his living quarters. I never thought I would see the place, but I was very curious to see it and the privacy it would provide us. "Thanks, I'll come over when the pie cools," I told him, trying my hardest not to look too excited. "Feel free to bring the pie to cool in my kitchen," Father said, taking his glass and a whole pitcher of lemonade to take with him to the little house behind the church. As soon as I was alone again, my thoughts raced. Was it appropriate? No, it couldn't be. But it couldn't stop me. Nothing could stop me from doing everything I could to get closer to Father Boss, no matter how sinful it was. God, please forgive me. If I ever had the opportunity, I would have confessed and repented for all of this, but the feeling I felt creeping into me was too great to ignore. The oven dinged, and I was distracted from my thoughts again. It was time to take that big step toward what could be hell disguised as paradise. I stood in front of the door of the little house where Boss's father lived and contemplated at the last moment what I was doing there, holding a pie in my mitten to protect my hand. With longing in my heart, I walked over and knocked on the thick wooden door and waited a few seconds, wondering if I should just turn tail and run out of there. But I didn't. I remained standing still as he walked over and opened the door, bestowing me with a welcoming smile that made my stomach flutter. "Please come in," my father said, stepping out of the way. Once inside, I found myself in a small living room. There was a small couch, a coffee table, and a TV on the wall. There were plants everywhere, nice and green. I was impressed with the place. It looked much more relaxing than the impeccably pious and sparsely decorated living room that no one used in my house. "Wow, I didn't realize you liked plants so much," I said. He grinned slightly. "Well, I have some greenery. I'm thinking of starting a garden for the community." Father Boss explained that I needed to follow him up the small staircase behind the couch. "The kitchen is over there through that doorway," he said as he walked up. I carried the pie into the small kitchenette and left it on the table, then walked up with him into a thin hallway with several doors. He led me to the first one on the left, which turned out to be a small office similar to the one downstairs. Father Boss had already laid out his laptop on the desk. There was an open Bible and papers scattered all over the desk, as well as 3 coffee cups standing in different places. The state of the room made me giggle slightly. It needed a woman's touch, that's for sure. "Sorry about the mess," he said, as he took a seat and gestured to a couch facing the large window overlooking the back of the church. I walked over and sat down, crossing one leg over the other and shaking my head. "It's all right, Father. You're a busy man, I'm sure. If you'd like, I wouldn't mind cleaning up the place for you," I offered, meaning it. In fact, I would really enjoy cleaning up after this man. "Oh, I can't ask you to do that. You're doing enough as it is. I have to be responsible for some things in my life, Julia. And I have a woman who comes in twice a week to do my cleaning for me," Father Boss replied with a soft laugh, looking at his computer screen. His fingers immediately began pressing keys, and he bit his lower lip, looking lost in his work. From his sermons, I was sure he was. I was silent for a moment, letting him work on his notes while I looked outside and enjoyed the beautiful view. "At least let me bring my coffee cups with me when I go to get a piece of pie," I finally said. The typing stopped immediately and he sighed playfully. "I suppose, if you must." He agreed easily, smiling and rolling his eyes. Being with him was so pleasant and soothing. I felt like I didn't have to think and I could just be myself with him. He was amazing. Why did he have to have a vocation to the priesthood? Father Boss would have made a great husband, which is me. Although, if he hadn't become a priest, I would never have had the honor of meeting such a man. I was grateful, though I envied the fact that he had devoted his whole life to the Lord. After sitting in the room with him and listening to the clicks of the keyboard, I bowed out and, taking the mugs with me, went down the stairs to get the pie. I spent a little time washing the mugs and putting them away where he would find them, and then took a slice of warm apple pie for Boss's father and brought it to him, along with a glass of lemonade for myself. "There you are," I said happily, placing the plate in front of him on the table and sitting back down. Boss's father's eyes glistened slightly as he looked at what I had prepared for him. He picked up his uniform, and before he could say anything, he groaned in a way that made my body involuntarily heat up. "Oh my God, Julia, this is delicious. Have you tried it yet?" he asked, already getting up from the table when I shook my head. He walked over with a plate in his hands and poked some of the pie onto the end of his fork, then brought it to my lips. I opened my mouth and took the pie, keeping my eyes on his icy blue eyes as I chewed and swallowed the sweetness. This is delicious," I giggled. I knew a lot about cooking and baking. I knew I could make the perfect apple pie for him, and I was proud of that fact. Instead of returning to his table, my father sat down next to me on the small couch, leaving little room between us as he finished the rest of the pie. When he finished, he set his plate on the small side table and leaned back in his chair, letting out a big sigh. "That was just the thing. Thank you so much for that, Julia. You're very talented," he complimented me, licking his lips from the crumbs. I looked over and noticed that his eyes were closed and his head was resting on the back of the couch. He really deserved a little rest after all the work he'd done. Plus, it was nice to just sit with him and relax without needing anything but him. After a couple minutes of silence, I felt his arm around my shoulders. I shifted my gaze to the priest and asked quietly, "I'm sorry. Is that too much?" he asked, catching my gaze. No, it's okay," I replied. Slowly, I began to snuggle up against him, feeling his warm and large body pressed against mine. Soon my head was on his shoulder, and I realized that we had crossed the line. It was obvious, but neither of us wanted to see it. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who was feeling homesick. Father Boss didn't pull away from me. In fact, I thought he pulled me even tighter against him. It didn't go any further than that. I lay pressed against him, enjoying the way he caressed my shoulder and breathing in the smell of his cigarettes on my body. For a while, we just cuddled on the couch. I felt like I could have stayed there for the rest of my life. But I knew it had to end someday, and it did. He took his hand away, stood up, adjusted his clothes, and looked at me again. "I think it's time for me to take you home before your family starts to worry." He sounded like everything was normal between us. I understood why. I'd sinned a lot, but Father Boss? Well, I didn't know what to call what he was doing. He'd be damned for getting so close to me, and I felt like it was all my fault. The priest drove a fairly standard sedan. It was plain, nothing fancy, but it did make it easier to not have to walk all the way home. I also enjoyed spending more time with him, leaning back in the comfortable seat and watching the small-town scenery float past us. The closer we got to home, the more I began to dread it. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to go back to my parents' world of total control. I was starting to like the freedom, but it was a forced evil. I had nowhere else to go. When he dropped me off and we said goodbye, it was bittersweet. I'd rather stay with Father Boss forever than go home to my prison, a boring old place with nothing to do but housework. As soon as I entered the house, Dad sniffed the air with exaggerated attention, and Mom stood back, arms crossed over her chest, looking pleased with herself. It was as if he was making excuses for her for what had happened that morning. I ended up staying in my room, missing the dinner my mom had made since I wasn't home to make it myself. That was fine with me, since I had more time to think about the man I really wanted to be with. I knew it was wrong, but at that moment I didn't care. I just wanted to be happy and be away from my parents. Over the next few weeks, I dove headfirst into my work at the church. I hardly ever left the house. I stayed there late into the night and started cooking dinner for Father Boss. He offered to let me eat with him, and as time went on, we learned more and more about each other. It seemed that while this was happening, the relationship between my parents became increasingly strained. By then, they were fighting almost every night, and the yelling made it hard for me to even fall asleep. I didn't understand what was wrong. After all, they never yelled. What was the problem when I was around? But the stress made me want to spend even more time out of the house, and more time in church with Father Boss. The church was my refuge. He was my comfort. By then, I had lost all respect for my parents and enjoyed the freedom I had when I was working. I could watch TV with him, and since he graciously offered, I even started sitting on the back door, stepped more often, and often shared cigarettes when we went out together. I still only took a couple puffs when the two of us sat there together. As time went on, I became more and more aware of how to enjoy his vice, so he would leave me a cigarette if he needed to go back inside. I only took a couple of cheeky puffs each time. There was a downside to this. I noticed that I now came home smelling our cigarettes. I was spending so much time with him. Not only did I notice it, but my dad wasn't shy about telling me how harmful it was, over and over again, like a broken record, that he, as a priest, should know better. I was even asked more than once if I smoked myself, and I tried my best to cover it up by lying about how I would never do that. He was starting to not like what was happening to me and obviously to my mom, but I had no sympathy for him. Every night I started not even praying for them, only for me to be with Father Boss. I became cold to my family, just as I felt they had been to me over the years. I must have overdone it, because one day I came home from church very late, after dinner, and found all my things packed and lying in the driveway. As I walked out of the house, stunned by what I saw, I noticed my father coming out of the house and approaching me, holding out his palm. "Keys." With eyes red with anger, that was all he said. He looked at me with such disgust that I felt uncomfortable. I slowly put the keys in his hands, and he recoiled from me as soon as they were in his hands. I took a step away from my father and watched as he turned to walk back into the house. "What am I supposed to do now?" I asked, shifting my gaze from him to my bags lying on the ground, and I stood up and grabbed my crucifix around my neck, fighting back tears. "It doesn't matter to me. Call your little priest friend to come to your rescue," he replied, without even turning around. With those words, my father went back into the house, and I was left alone with myself. Soon he even turned off the lights in the driveway, and I was left in the dark with all of my belongings. I quickly did as he suggested, and called Father Boss before he could turn off my phone as well. "Hello?" When I heard his strong voice purring through the receiver, I felt tears come to my eyes. I struggled to hold them back as I hurriedly explained what was going on. For a moment, I was afraid there was nothing he could do to help me. But after a short silence, he told me to hold on, and he would come right away. I didn't stay in the dark long before his headlights illuminated the driveway. He left them on, got out of the car, and helped me stow the few things I had in the trunk. Once we were back in the house and off the property, he looked at me, frowning slightly. "Are you okay?" I shrugged, tears already streaming down my cheeks. "I will," I replied. And I would, because I had to. After all, at rock bottom, there was no way out but up. I was homeless and had to rely on the kindness of my priest to have a place to sleep. Fortunately, he was full of goodwill. I was lucky to have an extra room in the small house where Father Boss lived, and he said I could use it as much as I needed. The room was beautifully decorated, with lots of mirrors, old paintings, and furniture. The bed was made of an old metal frame and covered with a large handmade quilt. Dr. Boss said it was sewn by an elderly woman who had recently passed away. She loved the church as much as I did. Of course, the paintings were just scenes from the Bible and Mother Mary. On the wall above my bed hung a beautiful crucifix with a figure of Christ, and I was comforted by the thought that from the first night I would sleep under the watchful eye of the Lord. I slept better than I thought I would, though it was a rough night with anxious thoughts putting me to sleep. Getting up the next morning, I dressed in a white and green leafy dress and a matching baggy green sweatshirt. After putting on my makeup, I applied the pink lipstick I had for special occasions and decided now was the time to put it on. After all, this was a new chapter in my life. Coming down from the bedroom, you could hear Father Boss humming a hymn to himself in his room, getting ready for a new day. I immediately went to the kitchen and was pleasantly pleased with the contents of the refrigerator. I began preparing a simple breakfast for the two of us: bacon, eggs, and toast. Normally, I could have done better, but I needed to get used to my new surroundings, and I knew morning mass was coming up. By the time Father Boss came down from his room, fresh and showered, in his usual casual clothes, I had already prepared a meal for him and put a glass of orange juice on the table. He looked surprised when he walked into the small kitchen. "Wow, I thought I smelled bacon," he said, as he sat down at the table. "Thanks, Julia. Really, you don't have to cook for me." "Of course, Father, and I feel the need to do things around here for a living." I put the dishes I'd been cooking with into the kitchen sink before sitting down across from him. He gave up quickly, already knowing I wouldn't back down. I can be pretty stubborn when I need to be. We ate breakfast together, sunlight pouring into the room through the large windows. It was soothing. After breakfast, we went outside for a smoke together before it was time to get ready for morning mass. It was nice to start the day with him like this. It was a fun thing to do. The mass was wonderful, and I felt truly cleansed. I felt like I was starting a whole new life there. I was finally out of my parents' care and could just live my life. At the end of the service, Father Boss announced that there would be a bake sale the following week and that we needed all the baked goods we could get. All proceeds, of course, would go to the church. After everyone left, I was alone with the priest and happily went to the church kitchen to make butterfly cupcakes to see what he thought of them. They turned out a little unusual. The wings were made from extra cake, there was sweet homemade frosting underneath, and the center was decorated with strawberry jelly. It took me a while to make them, but nothing else was going on, and I wanted to make my dad another sweet treat for letting me stay at his place. After spending quite a bit of time in the church kitchen, I finally came out of there with a plate that held the most beautiful dish I had made. I couldn't wait to show it to him, but as I entered the church, I heard him talking to a voice I recognized. I was shocked to see my mom standing there with him holding a bag. She looked at me with sad eyes and sighed slightly. "Hi, Julia. I'm here to pick up your things. We assumed you might be here." It felt strange to see her so soon after being kicked out, but I did my best to smile politely as I approached her with a plate in my hands. "Thanks, Mom. I appreciate it," I said, as I handed the plate to Boss's dad and took the bag she was holding. "Dad, I was wondering what you thought of my butterfly cupcakes for the bake sale you were talking about." "My goodness, they look delicious," he said, gently taking it in his hands and scrutinizing my work. "Do you want some, Mom?" I asked, not wanting to be rude to her, even though I was still upset about the way things had gone. She shook her head, which wasn't surprising, really. Mom never liked to have too many sweets in her diet, after all. "No, thanks, dear. They look good, though." She turned her back to Father Boss to speak to me. Not happy with the way things went between you and your father last night. I wish there was something I could have done. I tried to talk him out of it." While my mother was explaining this to me, I noticed Boss's father standing behind her and looking at me, bringing the cupcake to his mouth and running his tongue down the center, swallowing the jelly. It looked so obscene, but I thought it was only in my imagination until he winked at me. I couldn't believe he was actually teasing me like this, making my womanhood ache. I hoped my mom hadn't noticed my blush. If she did notice it, she didn't comment on it in any way, because looking back, she was otherwise occupied as she said goodbye to me, kissing me lightly on the cheek before leaving. "Oh," she stopped and turned to me on her way out of the church. "I won't be coming to Sunday Mass for a while. Grandma fell, and I need me to be with her while she recovers," explained Mom. Of course, I asked if Grandma was okay and was assured that she was fine. Of course she was, because knowing Grandma, she took everything to heart. She just needed help around the house while she regained her 100% health. Finding myself alone again, I looked over at my father, who was finishing his muffin, licking sugar off his fingers. "That was amazing, Julia. You should definitely make them to sell. I'm sure they'll be a hit," he complimented. "I'll be sure to say a prayer for your grandmother next Sunday." He hesitated for a moment, then wiped another drop of frosting on his cheek. The discomfort and anxiety I'd felt at the sight of my mom dissipated and was replaced by a warmth throughout my body. I smiled, happy that he liked them so much, and my mind kept going back to the way his tongue swept across the middle and winked at me. It was almost too much, but I had to control myself, at least until bedtime. I reached over to take the plate from him and giggled when I noticed that he had some icing left on his lips. Reaching up, I carefully wiped it off his skin and mindlessly brought the sugar cream to my mouth, licking it off my finger. I was a little shocked when I saw his face turn slightly red, and mine was a few tones deeper. I wanted to say something, to apologize, but he started laughing himself, and I was relieved that I'd been wronged. It was the first time I proposed to him myself, rather than just accepting it. I spent the next few days getting used to my new surroundings. It was not difficult, since I liked the little house we shared. I did everything I could to earn my stay, cleaning, cooking, even making lunches for the priest while he worked. It was difficult since he was constantly on the road, but I did my best. Now that we lived together, we understood each other more deeply. I felt so safe. There was no yelling and fighting over nothing. I knew he was there for me, in the other room, to protect me from evil. Although the only evil he couldn't chase away was my own lustful However, Father Boss was not always around. In fact, it was the opposite. Most of the time, he was away, running here and there, doing his duties for the parishioners. There were a few evenings when I would spend hours making him a lovely dinner, but it would get cold long before he arrived and had to be reheated in the microwave as soon as he walked through the door. Compared to life at home, where Mom was almost always around, it was a little lonely with the whole house to myself for hours on end. I missed my sewing machine. I could disappear for hours with it. So instead, I got used to cleaning and putting the house or church in order. I felt like I was doing a good deed. While I was busy cleaning and putting the house in order, I forgot about Margaret, the woman who volunteered to come and clean up after Father Boss a couple of times a week. She was a short, round woman who diligently went to church every Sunday Mass. I saw her at church often too, but this time was the first time she noticed that the house was already pretty well cleaned. It must have been strange to her, for I heard her shrill voice calling for Father Boss from upstairs. Leaving my room, I quietly walked to the stairs and listened to her questioning the man about all this. She had been cleaning up after him all the time he had been a priest, and he, with his very busy life, had never managed to keep the little house as clean as he did at that moment. Being the man of God that he was, Father didn't even try to lie to her. He immediately told her the truth and explained the situation as best he could. But even after his explanation, she looked disappointed, almost resentful of him for allowing a young woman like me to stay in the house with him. "It's just wrong, Father, and you know it," she bluntly stated to him. One morning I got up a little late and Father Boss must have already made breakfast. I could smell it as I walked up the stairs and into my room. I got dressed in one of my simple outfits that I usually wore. I walked down the stairs, anticipating what he had prepared, but my heart dropped into my stomach when I heard him talking to someone. It wasn't Margaret this time. His voice traveled up the stairs. I was surprised that there was another woman in the kitchen. She was dressed in tight jeans and a well-fitting shirt. She had long, straight red hair, and she was sitting in my seat, with Father Boss sitting across from her, enjoying a cup of coffee and the view out the window. Both of them turned their heads to look at me. "Good morning," he said with a smirk, stopping eating for a moment. "Julia, this is Rebecca. She's a friend from my hometown, just stopping by for a visit while she's traveling around town," he explained, picking up a mug of coffee to take a cautious sip. "Please join us," Father suggested. Not hungry, I settled between them with a cup of my own coffee, eyes downcast at first. "I've heard so much about you, Julia. You seem to be helping Evan a lot lately," she commented with a sweet, dashing smile on her face. "I'm sure you haven't heard anything about me. I'm not just an old childhood friend of the good priest. I was even his girlfriend at one time, before he ran off to God, and of course entered the priesthood," Rebecca explained. "I was a little shocked. I thought my father hadn't dated in his time, but I should have known that a man like him must have a history and must have dated at some point in his life." "Oh, that's interesting." I looked at them, and my stomach churned with jealousy. This woman was so beautiful, and she already had things I wanted from him, but who knows what she'd get from him now. "Do you visit us often? Will you join us for morning mass?" "When I have the opportunity and I'm near the city, I stop by. I'm concerned. I'm glad someone cares about Evan. He needs it," the woman laughed in relief. "As for the mass, I'll pass, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I'm not, how shall I put it, part of the church. I'm just passing through to meet a good friend. Just don't tell my husband. He'll be upset that he's not treated the same," she joked, laughing along with Father Boss. I chuckled a little myself, but only out of politeness. I felt awful about the whole thing. It was like a fire had been lit inside me. Somehow I wanted to pounce on the priest and show him that he was mine now, but it wasn't like that at all. And yet, I had a desire. I wanted to leave my mark on him. I didn't want other women to think they had a chance with him, even though I didn't have to think that way myself. We spent the rest of the time with her until morning mass. She was sweet and clearly loved Father Boss. She left right before we were supposed to go to church and my sanctuary, not giving me time to talk to Father before we were supposed to start. Perhaps it was for the best. I tried to give myself completely to his short sermon, but it was hard when all I could think about was what he must have done to that woman years ago. My mind was full of dirty thoughts, all sorts of lewd things they might have done together before he became a priest, and when we finished Mass, it was time for Father Boss to do the confessions. People lined up at the booth, waiting their turn to be saved from their sins, and I stood at the tail end. I rarely went into the booth in those days, not having much to tell him except what I really needed to keep to myself at the moment. While the others listened, I lit my own prayer candle and knelt before it, clasping my hands tightly together. It seemed to me that through Father Boss I needed to ask for more than just forgiveness. I wasn't sure I could get in, but eventually I did. I sat in silence for a while, wondering what I wanted to say to him. It seemed so much easier to do it outside of this formal setting. I didn't feel like doing it, but it was hard on my heart. I felt like I had to do it. "What can I do for you?" said Father Boss finally, not knowing it was me. At least, not yet. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." I spoke in a low voice, but I knew he could still hear me and that my voice was giving me away. On the other side, he was silent for a moment. "Yeah? What did you do?" His voice seemed to have gotten a little lower as well. I considered my next words carefully, afraid of how this might end for me, for us. I have let jealousy and lust take hold of my heart, Father. There is a man, one who does not belong to the women of this world, and I have fallen in love with him. Very much, I must say." It all sounded like a whisper. Swallowing, I waited for him to say something or stop all of this, but there was only silence in response. "This is so wrong, and ever since the feeling of attraction entered my body, I've been fighting it, but it's too strong, Father. This morning, I felt a twinge of jealousy watching him with another woman from his past. Before he took himself off the market, I wanted to be her and feel the same sensations she must have felt with him. At that moment, I heard the door on the other side of the stall open. For a second, I felt a deep nervousness before he walked over and opened the door for me. Rising from my seat, he looked holy because of the light from the sanctuary shrouding his head. He looked at me with icy blue eyes, and for a moment, I couldn't read his expression. Only when he reached out and took my hand did I rise to my feet and walk out of the confessional. I snuggled into his arms as he leaned in and our lips met. It was the most tender feeling in the world when I was kissed for the first time. I had never been this close to a man before. The feeling was fantastic as I wrapped my slender arms around his neck. It was like I was finally as close to him as I wanted to be. He picked me up in his arms and carried me to the back bench, where he gently laid me down before climbing on top of me. "Is that what you were jealous of?" he asked in a low tone, making me wince as I reached up and put my hands on his shoulders. I felt his hand move. I gave him a response, pulling the man to me and kissing him again. I had no idea what I was doing, but I followed Boss's father's example. I was in heaven, at least the one I was looking for. I was hooked. When he stepped back, Father Boss smirked, drawing little circles on the side of my leg. "This is all new to you, isn't it?" he asked, being able to read me so well. I hoped it wasn't because of the way I kissed. I nodded as he moved away from me, slowly sitting up and adjusting my skirt. "I could show you a lot more of what I did with Rebecca, but I think we need some privacy for that." The smirk on Father Boss's face let me know there was more to come. I wanted to find out. First, we had privacy by the back door, so he could make up for the lack of a morning cigarette. I sat in my usual spot on the back doorstep, and he stood in front of me, flicking his lighter and lighting a cigarette. Sitting there, I could tell he needed it. After the first puff, Father Boss leaned over and kissed me again, opening my mouth and releasing smoke into it. I didn't inhale but kissed him back passionately, having to pull away to let the smoke out and take a breath. Then I was handed a cigarette and took a couple puffs myself before handing it back to him and receiving another satisfying kiss. In the end, Dad didn't even finish his cigarette, putting it out in the flower pot so we could get back to the little house in the backyard before we were together again. No sooner had the door closed than I was in his arms, and he carried me to the little couch. Father Boss took advantage of this moment and put his hands on my hips. Our relationship grew more and more heated until there was a loud knock on the door. We stopped, both of us jumping a good foot away from each other. Father Boss was adjusting his clothes as he walked to the door. His blue eyes stayed on me for a moment before he opened the door and was met on the other side by Matthew from the choir. "Father Boss, we need you to come with us to the hospital immediately. Grandma doesn't have much time left in this world. She needs to be read her last rites," the man told him, looking past my father, and waved politely at me. He didn't suspect anything about the two of us, as we were often seen together by then. Matthew looked much younger than Boss's father. Perfect blonde hair, lean but stronger build, no wrinkles on his smooth face. He was a little younger than the priest, much closer to my age. But looking at the two of them, I still found Father Boss more attractive. Perhaps it had to do with the time we had already spent together. "Just a minute, I'll be right there." Father Boss left the door open, running up the stairs. While we waited those couple minutes, I talked to Matthew, telling him how sorry I was to hear about his grandmother and her condition. Miss Glenda was one of the nicest women I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. Father Boss was coming down the stairs with his Bible and rosary beads. We exchanged a very quick glance. It was a sad situation, but I felt warmth from Father Boss, and then he left, following Matthew to his car, left in the church parking lot. So, what do you think of the beginning of this intriguing story? I think I'm not the only one hooked by it. because I did a psychological analysis of the full story, and the results I came up with were not obvious to me at all. I continue to study and think on the topic of love and everything that goes with it, and at the end I will share my analysis with you. If you, my dear viewer, are looking forward to the new part of this story, then be sure to put a like and subscribe so I can see that you are really interested in the story and my comments on it. And also don't forget about Patreon. To be continued.